This 41st episode of American Spirits. Last time we covered the Anglo settlement of Texas and California, and today we come to the Alamo, the famous siege of that mission turned fortress. But how, you might ask, did they get their hands on the damn place in the first place? Well, we will discuss that and more in this coming episode. But first, Mr. Bagby, how are you this evening?
I'm doing well. I'm happy to be with you.
And I happy to be with you. Joining us again is our resident Southwest expert, Mr. Thomas Wayne Riley, should I say, the august Thomas Wayne Riley. His honor, the Thomas Wayne Riley. How are you this evening, sir? Uh, Well, yes, give it a few months. All right. Well, Mr. Riley, this is your wheelhouse. What do you have for us tonight? Ah, wonderful company. Mm. Mr. Wayne Riley? That was inspiring, so much so, and because I forgot to plug you into the audio for the stream, please read it again.
Okay, this is from the distinguished owner of, well, this is from Tallman Books. The distinguished owner has reprinted Nathaniel Stevenson's 1912 Texas and the Mexican War. And so I wanted to open this episode with this really nice quote. Whatever motive may have guided them, thousands of Americans felt an irresistible desire to pitch their tents in the sunset. From every section, from every class, pilgrims were drawn to Texas, the very seat of fortune in the American mind during the 20s. Its noble woods, its great prairies, the land that could be had for next to nothing. These were potent magnets. Furthermore, it was the land of romance, of mystery. It was the borderland of the strange Spanish world. To the adventurous soul, it called in the deep murmur of the forest, in the wind across the trackless prairie. I am the unknown. To the dreamer of democracy, it whispered grimly of possible revolution, of the last death struggle between the people and the kings. And so I think
Mm.
we should start today's episode by introducing Sam Houston.
Who might that be?
He is pretty awesome, actually. In 1832, the 6'2", 39-year-old rode into Texas, and he had a special passport in his pocket from his good friend, President of the United States, Andrew Jackson. Houston had orders to meet with the Comanche to make a deal to stop raiding, settlements over across the Sabine. But his true goal may have been to turn Texas from a colony to the state of the United States, because Andrew Jackson failed many times to outright buy it from Mexico.
Indeed. Sam Houston had come back from two major personal disasters leading up to this point. Like he's really a wrecked man looking for a new start at this stage in his life. He had formerly been governor of Tennessee and good friend of Andrew Jackson way back then. He was elected to the governor's seat same year Jackson was elected to the White House. And a couple years later, he married the daughter of his preacher. And as soon as they got home from their honeymoon, she left him.
Huh.
They separated. She went back to her father's house. And to this day, we really don't know why. Um, one interesting theory is that Houston's wounds from the War of 1812, where he fought the Creeks in Alabama. He was wounded horrendously. He took almost a decade to recover from these wounds, bullets and arrows. And one curious theory is that the modesty of the day was such that his betrothed had no idea what physical condition he was in. He was wounded very badly in the groin, for instance, with an arrow, and it was plucked from his side.
Yeah.
And that was a very nasty wound. And we've got good reason to believe that it may have not fully healed at that point, may have still been a very ugly sight. That first wife, she ended up remarrying later on. The marriage got annulled, but she named one of her sons Sam Houston. So that indicates she wasn't particularly bitter about him, which is also really weird. Like, historians have tried to piece this together and figure out what happened. We don't have a straight answer on this. We have some theories. But Houston goes out to the Indian Territory in Oklahoma right afterwards, marries a half Cherokee woman named Tiana. Houston then famously assaults a congressman in Washington, D.C. He actually assails him on Pennsylvania Avenue after the congressman insults Houston, then draws a gun on him. The gun misfires and Houston beats him into a pulp. Well, Congress fines Houston for that because Congress is in session. And rather than pay the fine, Houston resolves to go to Texas. So the fine was like $500, which is close to $10,000 in our money. It's a substantial sum. Houston
His
didn't
lawyer
have
for
it.
that trial was Francis Scott Keys.
That's right.
And he was so
Yeah.
bad at being a lawyer, Houston fired him and defended himself, which he, lost. But
Well, no doubt, Francis Scott Key was very frustrated with Houston. Houston appeared before Congress to talk about his assault of Congressman Stansbury and said, "I beat him like a dog, and I would do it again." This guy drew a gun on me. This was in front of the White House where this altercation took place. It's a very amusing story. But what's more pathetic about it is he goes back to the Indian Territory in Fort Gibson, Oklahoma, and he tells his wife, "We're off to Texas," and she says no. And so he procures a Cherokee divorce and gives her everything. So he goes to Texas with the clothes on his back and his saddlebags and his horse. So he is starting all over again. And he's got to be in his late 30s at this point.
39.
Two huge personal disasters. Most people don't come back from that, but Houston did. And that makes him a most inspiring American hero, in my opinion.
I agree. This wasn't really even his first time starting over. When he was a teenager in Tennessee, he ran away and lived with the Cherokee. This was before they were removed. He lived with them for 3 years. And there's a great quote from him. He said, he later wrote about it in his autobiography. He said that he spent his time wandering along the banks of streams, side by side with some Indian maiden, sheltered by the deep woods, running wild, sleeping on the ground, chasing game, living in the forests, making love, and reading Homer's Iliad.
He was a huge fan of Homer.
Yeah.
He loved Homer. Homer was a major factor in his life.
Yep. Well, I thought that was pretty cool. And after he left the governorship, actually, like 2 days after the marriage, 2 days after they got married, he was having a snowball fight with these two young girls that were friends, the daughters of their friends. And his wife said, "I wish they would kill him." So I don't know what happened there. I have no idea. Nobody does, like you said. But he would get pretty good and drunk for a long time. The Cherokee would rename him, I'm not going to say the Cherokee, Big Drunk. They would rename him from the Raven to Big Drunk. And then he would end up in Texas. And there's a story that maybe on his way to the Cherokee after leaving Tennessee, on his way out to Oklahoma, he was on a boat and he probably met with Jim Bowie.
Hmm.
So when he got to Texas a few years later, he met back up with Jim Bowie. And so Jim Bowie, of course, is the famous knife fighter. His father was a Georgian, and his father had followed Daniel Boone to Spanish Missouri, future French Louisiana. And he was described as being, like raw boned big and rawhide tough. And he was known for lassoing and riding deer and alligators. Not sure if that one's true, but I hope it is. Jim's brother, I think I briefly mentioned it in the last episode, but Jim's brother had been a part of the Republic Army of the North and the Green Flag Rebellion. And that was when Santa Anna had first entered Texas and they just left the bones littered and hung them from trees and stuff. And Jim was on the ill-fated Long filibuster. So Bowie knew Texas pretty good. He was in business with Jean Lafitte, smuggling pirates and forging Spanish land grants and then selling the land that he did not own. So
He was a real entrepreneur. He
yeah,
came into the Louisiana territory where the Anglo-Americans didn't speak the Mexican language, and he forged these Spanish land titles and sold them off. And he didn't know Spanish either. He just wrote out something that sounded like Spanish, and then he stained the land titles with coffee to make them look old and rumpled,
Mhm.
and then he would skip town.
and he made a
So
lot of money.
Jim Bowie had a lot of enemies.
Oh yeah,
That's
there's
one of the reasons why he went on to Texas.
yep. The 1827. So there was a dual pistol or a pistol with duels. Both men missed, but Bowie was a second for his duelist, I guess. And the other second, they were like, I don't care if this fight's not going down between y'all. We're going to fight. So they did. They fought. Bowie, it was on a sandbar in the Mississippi River. Bowie disemboweled a man and he ripped
Oh.
another man to shreds. Or as he put it, he cut the man's heartstrings. But I mean, Bowie was shot in the chest. He was shot in the hip and he was stabbed 7 times. After that, he gone to Texas, GTT. And in Texas, he also got in more knife fights. Some saloon keeper hired like 3 knife thugs, and the first guy to attack Bowie was immediately nearly decapitated by 1 slash. The second guy cut Bowie's leg before he got his guts ripped open. And the story goes the third guy got his head cut in 2 from the top of the skull to the chin.
Hmm.
Yeah. And he hunted for lost treasure. He fought Indians, fought Mexicans, escaped from custody. And one Indian battle saw him fight with 9 friends over 160 Indians and won. But he did have a beautiful blonde Spanish wife. Her father was the vice governor of Coahuila, Tejas, the Veramindi clan, who will come up again. And Jim Bowie will be at the Alamo. So after he sobered up, went to Washington, got in the fight. That didn't go well. So then he went to Texas. And when he got to Texas in 1832, he went to the largest town. It had been abandoned multiple times, but Nacogdoches, and he met with influential men there who pointed him in the direction of Austin. And he did go talk to the Comanche like he was supposed to. And then after that, he talked to Austin. And nobody knows what they said, but Austin did shortly after that write a pretty compelling quote. And he wrote, "A successful military chieftain is hailed with admiration and applause, and monuments perpetuate his fame. But the bloodless pioneer of the wilderness, like the corn and cotton he causes to spring where it never grew before, attracts no notice. No slaughtered thousands or smoking cities attest his devotion to the cause of human happiness. And he is disregarded by the man of the world as a humble instrument to pave the way for others." I do assume that is about he and Houston, but it may not be. So Houston returned to Nacogdoches. This is 1833. He was pretty much appointed like leader of the, let's see, I'm going to make this right. Leader of, I guess, the leader of Nacogdoches. And he stayed there and opened up a law firm. He also wrote to Jackson and said, hey, right now with the Civil War going down south, if you want to take Texas, now is the time. We don't know what Jackson's reply was. Let's see. By now, the war party led by Wharton was kind of getting more attention and more fame, more so than Austin, who was still at this time saying we should respect Mexico and we should stay a state. So they wrote up a Constitution of Texas, modeled after the Constitution of Massachusetts. And I think, Mr. Bagby, you said that you've got the text for that.
I've got the Texas Declaration of Independence, but I might be preempting you there.
Okay, yeah. Sorry. They wrote
Not
a constitution.
Quite there yet.
Yeah. They wrote a constitution because they wanted to become their own separate state, separate from Coahuila, because Saltillo, the capital, is too far away. So they wrote this constitution, they gave it to Austin and said, can you take this down to Santa Ana in Mexico City? Well, once Austin was in Mexico City, he lost all faith in the Mexican government, and he would write to the Texans and say, the fate of Texas depends upon itself and not upon this, meaning the Mexican government, which was a turnaround for Austin, who had always appealed to the colonists to be loyal to Mexico. Well, Austin did get to meet.
Being imprisoned will do that to you.
Oh, well, he's about to be in prison for 2 years because when the Tejanos got that letter, they sent it right back down to Santa Ana. So on his way back to Texas, Santa Ana had Austin arrested, and he spent 2 years in Mexico City, a couple months in confinement, and then in prison, and then a year under house arrest in Mexico City. He could wander the streets, but after 2 years, he would be released. But while he was gone, cholera struck, killing Jim Bowie's wife and their children. And even Austin in Mexico City got cholera and almost died. So that hurt the colony. But for about 2 years, things kind of calmed down. And the Texans were willing to just hopefully become a state. Santa Ana did repeal the law of 1830, the law of 1830, which really helped the Texans. But at the same hold on. Okay. In 1835, Santa Ana installed a fake Congress, passed a ton of sweeping laws, deposed federalist governors, including the entire government of Coahuila, Texas, and soldiers marched into Saltillo and arrested the government. And then those soldiers were led by Santa Ana's brother-in-law, General Martin Perfecto de Cos. Obviously, this was a little worrying to the Texans. And the Texans asked Sam Houston, kind of now their default leader, now that Austin was gone. They're like, what should we do? And he was like, we're not ready. We got to wait. He wrote, unrestrained ebullitions of feeling would be likely to plunge Texas into a bloody struggle with Mexico before she was prepared for it. So he was like, let's hold off for a little bit. But by June of 1835, some troubles began at a place called Anahuac. The Mexican military leader there seized an Anglo merchant ship, and naturally the Texans gathered to protest this. When they discussed what to do, a Mexican courier rode into town with 3 letters. The Texans seized him and read the 3 letters. So all 3 letters were bad news. They found out the state government had been disbanded and Santa Ana's brother-in-law had been put in charge, as in Coahuila, Texas. The second letter stated that troops were on their way to secure Texas. And the third letter declared that once the other states had been put down in this kind of nationwide rebellion, Santa Ana was personally leading an army into Texas to punish the Americans. So when Texans to the west of Anahuac and San Felipe de Austin, when they heard the news, William Barrett Travis, a very important figure, he gathered an army of 25 men and 1 cannon, and he headed towards Anahuac. So they wanted to beat General Cos to the fort. General Cos was going to be dropped off, I believe, on the coast at Copano. So they did beat him to the fort, and they fired one cannonball on June 29th. The Mexicans immediately surrendered. The 40 men in the fort were promised that they won't be hurt if they leave Texas and never return. So it felt like a win at the time. But when William Barrett Travis got back to San Felipe, all of his neighbors were mad at him. They were like, "You may have just started a war." So they all wrote letters apologizing to Santa Anna, and even Travis was forced to write a letter of apology. But General Coase and Santa Anna did not accept the apologies.
There's a really interesting dichotomy that develops here in the story of Texas between the conservatives who do not want any radical change and the radicals who say, no, we've got to split from this government. We don't have a way to fix this. And as things develop, the radicals develop their position. It seems that the reconciliation with Santa Anna's dictatorship is just too humiliating, and violence, like organized militia movements that result in violence and killing, actual death, is the instigation for a deeper conflict, as we'll see. The Texans do have a very long-suffering and conservative attitude through this, as we've seen with Austin and his attitude towards Mexico. But there are certain lines that get crossed that seem to me to be a predictable pattern.
Yep, I absolutely agree. And in September of 1835, Austin returns. And he was a changed man after this. He wrote his cousin a pretty good quote. He said, "A gentle breeze shakes off a ripe peach. Can it be supposed that the violent political convulsions of Mexico will not shake off Texas so soon as it is ripe enough to fall? The fact is, we must and ought to become a part of the United States." So he had almost completely flipped his views by the time he got back.
Mexican statehood no longer good enough.
No longer good enough. Now they will, as I'll talk, they will vote one more time to stay a state, but it'll be too late. So William Wharton of the War Party, Austin, they were never really at odds, but they did have competing political views. Austin openly told William Wharton that Santa Anna was a, quote, "base, unprincipled, bloody monster. War is our only recourse. No halfway measures, but war in full." So, all across Texas after this, once Austin returned, committees of public safety sprang up, and Houston would send dispatches to the United States. And one Daniel Cloud, who I think I'll quote again later, but he wrote, "The cause of philanthropy, of humanity, of liberty, and human happiness throughout the world calls loudly on every man who can to aid Texas." So in Texas, they were kind of getting ready to meet the Mexican army, Coase, who had just landed at Copano, and the Mexican commander in San Antonio, Colonel Domingo de Ugartecha. This is when he sends the 100 ill-trained convict soldiers to Gonzales, which we talked about last time, with the come and take it flag. 160 Texans meet with these 100 convict soldiers. Some volleys were exchanged, and 1 or 2 Mexicans were killed. But 1 Texan was injured. It was the first casualty of the Texas Revolution. And a guy who was at every major battle in the Texas Revolution, a man named Noah Smithwick, he describes the injury he writes very well. He describes this poor injured Texan. He said, a Texan, quote, "took a header from his horse, thereby bringing his nasal appendage into such intimate association with Mother Earth as to draw forth a copious stream of the sanguinary fluid." So he busted his nose. These Mexican convicts retreat to San Antonio, and the Texans followed them. Coase will also send a small group of soldiers to a place formerly known as La Bahia, but is now named Goliad. And the Mexican soldiers were sent there to protect a battery of shot and powder and also to keep the road to the Gulf open. That's how I assume Santa Anna's going to get there, but he's not going to be able to. On October 9th, a week after their first victory, the Texans, they sneak into Goliad with the help of the Tejanos. They find their way to the commander's quarters and they forced a surrender. So now they have cut off the road from the sea to San Antonio. And so any future invasion will have to be from the south by land, a much, much tougher journey. And it also meant that Coase is he's cut off from further provisions, which will aid in the coming siege. And it is important to note that the captured Mexicans this time and at Anahuac, they were sent to Austin, who treated them gentlemanly and released them to go back home. The Texans will continuously do this. Santa Anna will not. Hence the Alamo. In Nacogdoches, when Houston heard of the fighting, he immediately rallied all the men. He became the commander, and he would say at that time, "The morning of glory is dawning upon us. The work of liberty has begun." And then he would set off for San Felipe de Austin, not to help in the coming siege, but to gather men delegates. There we go, for the coming convention. So by now, the word had spread through Texas. There were 300 more Texans poured in to volunteer to fight over at Gonzales, but they did need a commander. Houston couldn't be because he was going to be at the delegation, so naturally, Austin accepted, even though he was near death at only 42, and he had never been a soldier or commander, but he accepted because he was kind of the main figure in Texas at that time. After seeing these sorting the unruly soldiers into I think 3 companies, he really wasn't leading them. He was kind of following them as their leader. He followed them on their first campaign, which was going to be attack Coase, Ugartechea, and there's 600 regular soldiers and then I think like 500 volunteer soldiers at San Antonio. And they also had 20 cannons. And by now, Coase had fortified and barricaded the city. So the Federal Army of Texas, as they called themselves, would leave Gonzales on October 12th, and they would obviously take the come and take it banner. They even dragged the cannon, although they abandoned it halfway after its wheels fell off. So there's a great quote about how this group looked. And this is, again, from Noah Smithwick. He said, "The buckskin breeches were the nearest approach to uniform, and there was wide diversity even there, some being new and soft and yellow, while others, from long familiarity with rain and grease and dirt, had become hard and black and shiny. Boots being an unknown quantity, some wore shoes and some moccasins. Here a broad-brimmed sombrero overshadowed the military cap at its side. There a tall Begum rode familiarly beside a coonskin cap, with the tail hanging down behind. Here a big American horse loomed up above the nimble Spanish pony. There a half-broke Mustang pranced beside a sober, methodical mule. A fantastic military array to a casual observer, but the one great purpose animating every heart clothed us in a uniform more perfect in our eyes than was ever donned by regulars on dress parade." But in reality, they had more men than guns, very little powder, very little bullets. It was going to be a tough fight. But they did make it to the outskirts of San Antonio. Along the way, they got into a brief skirmish, which they won. The Mexicans fled. And on October 15th, the Texan army was met up with Juan Seguin, who was the son of the man who rode with Austin through Texas when he first arrived. He said, pretty much, "I've got 30 Tejanos who can all ride and act as cavalry." So obviously, they were brought on board. Now, in 8 years or so, Juan Seguin will switch sides to the Mexicans after they gain their independence. And for 6 years, he'll be with the Mexicans, and then he'll come back to Texas and be a constable. So that was the nature of Texas politics back then, I suppose. On October 27th, the Texans were less than 5 miles outside San Antonio. And Austin sent Jim Bowie with 92 men to find a good staging area. And they found it at a mission named Conception, only about 500 yards from San Antonio. And this little mission was on the San Antonio River. Bowie was told to find it and then come back, but instead he set up camp. So the following morning, October 28th, Coase learned of this force under Bowie, and he sent men to destroy it. So, of course, in cinematic fashion, it's early morning and thick, heavy fog, and the Mexicans were approaching. And the Texans could hear them, could sense, they knew that cannons were rolling and men were marching towards them. And then in the fog, a bullet crashed into a Texan. Now, he was unhurt, but he shouted, "Boys, the scoundrels have shot off my powder horn." So Bowie figured the Mexicans would be coming. So this mission was in a bend of the San Antonio River. So he had his men go on either side of the bend because the Mexicans would have to funnel through the bends in the river to get to their position. And he had them dig with their knives, probably Bowie knives, into the side of the river bank so they could duck, come out, shoot, and duck. And so, well, that's pretty much exactly what happened. So at 8 a.m., the Battle of Conception began. The Mexicans fired volley after volley, and they had 2 cannons. And of course, the Texans returned fire from behind the riverbank, and the Texans' fire was so much better. I'll explain that in just a second. But the Mexicans then opened up with a grape shot on the entrenched scouts, and there's a cool story. Lining the river were pecan trees, and the grape shot would drop all these loads of fresh pecans onto the Texans, who, cool as cucumbers, cracked them open and ate them right there during the battle. And the Texans' shots were extremely slow. And so they would wait, they would find their bead, and they would take the shot, and they were very successful. And the Mexican losses began to add up. Because, these Texans' rifles were just far superior. The artillery, the men loading the artillery and firing, their crews were killed 3 times by the Texans. They did not want to be shot at by this cannon. So for a while, the cannons were silenced, and the Mexicans, firing the whole time, failed to do any damage whatsoever. One Texan wrote that they were harmless, like literally harmless. He said, "We wondered to see that their balls often fell short of us. And the balls that did reach their target, this happened multiple times, would bounce off the Texans, leaving a bruise. There was one guy who had a black eye from the battle because a bullet hit him in the forehead and just bounced off."
What accounts for this? Did the Mexicans have shoddy powder or what?
So there are 3 main things. The Texans' Kentucky rifles, which could hit a target at 200 yards. And the Mexicans had a 10-pound, 75 caliber, 100-year-old British gun that was so inaccurate, the manufacturers didn't even put a gun sight on it. And the recoil of that gun was so bad that they fired from the hip, lest the gun break their faces or shoulders. And so they couldn't aim for crap. And their powder was so bad, it was described as being little better than charcoal. So that was pretty much it.
This was a consistent problem with the Mexican army, and it apparently is due to corruption with military contractors. During the Mexican War, this is a very serious problem for the Mexican army. They are firing artillery rounds at the Americans up by the Rio Grande. They get into artillery duels there with the army of Zachary Taylor. And the cannonballs are moving so slowly, the Americans can dodge them.
Sam Grant writes about that. Yeah, Ulysses S. Grant writes about that.
It's a consistent problem that the Mexican army has as far as quality of powder. That's certainly a factor.
Yeah, and I'm deep into my Mexican War series right now, and absolutely just read about the Battle of Monterrey, and they were mostly firing cannonballs, not. They did fire a grape shot within the city walls of Monterrey, but the cannonballs do gruesome things, but Grape shot and light artillery is far more useful in battles like these than a giant 18-pound, or I mean, the ball is 18 pounds. So the gun itself is massive and has 10 oxen pulling it. And then once it's there, it can't move. And not right now, but by the Mexican War, here's a little tangent, but the Americans had developed something called flying cavalry that was only used, I think, like 3 horses, pulled this little cannon very fast, and they could set it up. And if needed to be moved, they could move it. And it just decimated the Mexicans at the 2 battles near the Rio Grande, Resaca de la Palma, and, well, actually not that one, but Palo Alto, just destroyed the Mexicans. So after some time, there was one Texan who was killed, only one. His name was Richard Andrews, and he came up from the cover of the bank because he thought his buddies were being like overran on the other bank. So he ran through this open area and took some grape shot to the guts, and it was really bad. But they finally took down a rebel. So the Mexicans pressed, they kind of charged, and they didn't stand a chance. They fell, tons of them, tens of them. And so they retreated. And Bowie led a charge. They all got up out of the riverbank. They ran through the field and they captured the cannons, turned them around, and then opened fire on the fleeing Mexicans. And at the same time, so now they're running back into the city, San Antonio. And at the same time, William Barrett Travis, he arrives with a cavalry charge and just cuts through even more of the men that are trying to get through the gate of San Antonio. And at the end, 76 of the Mexicans would be killed or wounded. And only Andrews died for the cause of liberty. I don't know if I should say it, but it was really bad. It took him a long time to die, and nobody would kill him. So he started tearing at his own wound to hasten death. It's terrible. So the Texans realized they cannot assault San Antonio. So they laid a siege. And I guess we ended the episode last week with that. Elsewhere, right after this battle, on November 3rd, some Texans took a Mexican fort called La Pantitlan, but it was described as little more than a second-rate hog pen. They gathered 2 cannons and 14 horses. They didn't take the gunpowder and they did not take the guns. They burned the small fort, and then they headed back to Goliad, where they ran into the leader of La Pantitlan, and they had a little skirmish on the Nueces River. It went the exact same way as the Battle of Conception. The Americans waited in the riverbank or behind trees. The Mexicans advanced and were cut down. So again, only one Texan casualty. This poor guy killed a Mexican and then was reloading, and he took a slug to his right hand, lost 3 fingers, and then it hit his left hand. The Mexicans lost 5 killed and 17 wounded, and 20 missing. Among the missing were the mayor, or alcalde, the judge, and the sheriff of a town called San Patricio. But the weather after the battle was so bad. There was a norther, blew in, and it was cold. So they sank the 2 cannons, and then they just went back to Goliad. So now we kind of got to get back to Sam Houston. So he rode 150 miles south towards San Antonio on a little yellow Spanish stallion, and apparently his legs were dragging in the dirt. So he was immediately offered command of all the troops by Austin, who did not want to do this anymore. But Houston refused. He gathered his delegates for the convention and then went back up to, I think this was still Washington on the Brazos.
So the convention is an interesting episode, and once again we see the conservative element predominating. There is a motion to declare independence at this point, in spite of the battles at San Antonio, the capture of the Alamo, and so on. The conservatives prevail, and the vote was 33 in favor of negotiations with Mexico, 15 for independence. So they produce what's called a Declaration of Causes. And among other things, they say, we must live under a constitutional government We believe in a republic and not dictatorship. We want a federal system. And so this is a tribute to the old system, which is now almost completely abolished in Mexico. Santa Anna has already led his federal or his national army against the federals that are left in Mexico, the defenders of the federal cause that are rallying to their state governments and resisting Santa Anna. Santa Anna subdues them. So this is a motion towards a system that's now dead. But the conservatives are hoping against hope that this declaration of causes is going to rally like conservative or liberal support down in Mexico against Santa Anna. Nothing of the sort happens. So we move on. There is a second convention that's called just a few months later in March of 36 at Washington on Brazos. Once again, Sam Houston is there. Now Sam Houston is of the opinion that the time is ripe. They have the swell of opinion. The news of these military actions has made its way to the north, and the Texans are rallying to the cause of independence. They've gotten a lot more news from Mexico. They know that the old Constitution of Mexico is dead at this point, the 1824 Constitution. And so on March 2nd, 1836, there is a motion for independence. And that's where we get the famous Texas Declaration of Independence. At this point, they know Santa Anna is approaching with an army of 4,000 men. And they write a declaration reminiscent of the American Declaration of 76. But they have some interesting remarks. They say, here's a key passage. When the federal Republican Constitution of their country, which they have sworn to support, no longer has a substantial existence, and the whole nature of their government has been forcibly changed without their consent from a restricted federative republic composed of sovereign states to a consolidated central military despotism in which every interest is disregarded, but that of the army and the priesthood, both the eternal enemies of the civil liberty, the ever-ready minions of power, and the usual instruments of tyrants. So we see a couple of interesting remarks against the Catholic religion, which, of course, Santa Anna does support as the national religion of Mexico. It retains its official status under Santa Anna's despotism. The Texans make a big show of their support for the federal Constitution of Mexico. In the Texas Declaration of Independence, they forget they'd also made a pledge to be Roman Catholic. And this was something that they at least nominally accomplished by their entry into Texas. That was the other term. In the Texas Declaration of Independence, they, among other things, they say, to be Roman Catholic means to be anti-Republican. We are not going to align with the Catholic faith. We are going to be liberal in religion. We will be Protestants once again. They don't say that in as many words, but there are several allusions to Catholic establishment in the Texas Declaration of Independence.
What was Santa Anna's relationship with the church? I know he was a Freemason, so I can't imagine he was particularly a throne and altar guy. What was his settlement with the church?
Santa Anna supports the official status of the Catholic Church in Mexico, which is a major political interest. There is a long history of Freemason nominal Catholics in politics in Mexico, and Santa Anna is one of their famous examples.
So, if I could, can we talk about the Battle of San Antonio?
By all means.
Absolutely.
Okay. It's very cool, and it really, some of these veterans will help in the Mexican War 10 years later, because this is kind of well, I'll get to it in a minute. But at that first convention in November of 1835, like you said, they're going to remain Mexican, but they want their own state. They appoint a man named Henry Smith as governor, and they send Austin to the U.S. to gather arms, men, and money. And they also hand over the army to an Indian fighter named Edward Burleson. And the Texas legislature will call him the hero of 30 battles who was never known to retreat. So he's going to be pretty useful in this upcoming battle. Up in the United States, the news of Texas, people were glued to the news of Texas. It was like the American independence all over again. So money was pledged. Thousands of men signed up to drop what they're doing, grab their rifle, and make their way for the Sabine River. And almost all of these men would be too late for the Alamo. But there was one group called the New Orleans Grays, and 120 men signed up, and they either crossed the Sabine River or they were dropped off by boat at Galveston, and they were given a flag, a blue silk flag with the words, "First Company of Volunteers sent by New Orleans to Texas." And it has a flying eagle in the center of it, and the eagle is holding a white sheet that said God and liberty. And they would fly that over the Alamo, and it will be the only thing of the New Orleans Grays who stay at the Alamo that will survive. The banner is now displayed in Mexico City as a spoil of war. A war, the Texas Independence War, Mexico will lose it, and the Texan independence will spawn the Mexican-American War, which Mexico, spoiler alert, will also lose.
Tell me, where are the spoils of the Alamo kept in Mexico?
In Mexico City, at a museum. I do not remember which one.
Do you think it's the castle?
It might, yeah. I need to. The book I read, Stephen Harrigan's Big Beautiful Thing About Texas, it says exactly where it is, so I can go back and maybe I'll put it in the comments or something. But I would like to go see it one day.
I would, certainly.
Yeah, I mean they took, and I'll describe them taking it almost at the very end of our story today. But so Austin left. It was given to Burleson. The siege is going well, but there were tons of desertions, and the men were very soggy from a little bit of rain, but mostly from corn juice, corn liquor.
Mhm.
But at least they kept the cavalry kept couriers from going in and out of San Antonio. Coase and his men were having a rough time. But the army of 800 was now down to 450. They were drunk, sickness swept through camp, and they were just wanting to go home. They were bored. And so just when the siege was about to be abandoned, and actually it was ordered to be abandoned by the governor, there was one man that rallied the entire Texan force on December 4th. He was an old battle-hardened Texan named Ben Milam. He said, first of all, he had been on the long filibuster campaign. A lot of these guys had been. So all these Texans were trying to quit the field, but Milam said, "Who will go with old Ben Milam into San Antonio?" And apparently everyone wanted to.
Mhm.
By the morning of the 5th, it was still dark. The Texans arranged themselves into two columns. One was led by Ben Milam and the other by a man named Francis W. Johnson. In the cover of darkness, the Texans dragged one of the cannons across the San Antonio River and opened fire in the direction of the Alamo. It was a barracks at that time. I'll talk about the Alamo in more detail in a little bit. So after that cannon shot, it was a distraction. The Mexican bugles roared, and the Texans, just on the other side of town, they ran in. They flooded the city, unopposed completely. And they had two destinations in mind near Military Plaza. And that was the home of De La Garza and the home of the Veramindis. That would be Bowie's now deceased wife and her very rich family. So technically the house belonged to Jim Bowie. They would make it to within 100 yards of their destination before the Mexicans finally realized that the Texans were within the gates. So they rolled up over the cannons and they shot grape shot through the streets. Obviously, the Texans immediately forced themselves inside whatever building was close at hand. So now this would be a true urban battle. They went from house to house, roof to roof, and room to room. They avoided the streets and the alleys because they didn't want to get shot by a grape shot. And one soldier described how they did it. He said, "We went through the old adobe and picket houses of the Mexicans, using battering rams made out of logs 10 or 12 feet long. The stout men would take hold of the logs and swing them a while and let drive endwise, punching holes in the walls through which we passed. Oh, how the women and children would yell when we knocked the holes in the walls." So the Texans' guns were far superior. There was a man named Creed Taylor. He was a participant. He would ride to the battle and he would say, "No sooner did a head appear above the wall than it was the target for a dozen hunting rifles, and there was always another dead Mexican." So despite the Mexicans' inability to hit the broadside of a barn, the fighting was very fierce. And there were a few Mexicans who had the privilege of shooting a British Baker rifle, which were just as good as the Kentucky rifles the Texans had. And on the third day, Ben Milam was hit in the head by a Mexican sniper and died instantly. This sniper had one of those British Baker rifles, and he shot Ben Milam from a tree along the river, and he was then shot by every Texan that could see him. So this left Francis Johnson in charge.
My vision of San Antonio at this point is formed by film. I think of Fess Parker as Davy Crockett and John Wayne's movie about the Battle of the Alamo. Not this battle, of course, but the later one, the massacre. And San Antonio is portrayed as on a desert prairie or a steppe, no woods around at all. I was very surprised when I finally visited the Alamo quite a while ago, and now it is like a bosque. It's full of old trees. It's rich shade. There are even koi ponds inside the grounds of the Alamo with lots of funny Japanese fish and stuff. And it's a very different kind of environment. Do you know, Riley, what was the environment when these battles were fought?
That's a good question. I went to San Antonio 2 years ago, and I can't separate. Well, I can picture it. It would have been a town by itself, surrounded by fields with woods along the river, and maybe too far north for Chaparral, but something approaching Chaparral, probably on the outskirts. And the town, no doubt, was made of adobe houses. The Veramendi mansion was stone, no doubt. That's why they were running towards it. And probably the De La Garza house as well, probably made up a similar material as the Alamo. And yeah, they were probably on the outskirts. No, I know actually they're on the outskirts. There were also a bunch of wooden homes because the Mexicans try to take a small wooden, like a couple of wooden houses next to each other, but the Americans burned them down. That's in March of 36 during the Alamo siege. But so, I mean, it was, I think, very rural with a few beautiful houses. They had a church. That's why the Alamo was abandoned, because they had a big, beautiful church. And so I think parts of it would have been very nice, and other parts would have been probably look like Santa Fe does now or something similar. Well, parts of Santa Fe.
I think all the references to the adobe houses is good evidence there wasn't much workable wood in the area. So maybe the portrayal of the broad open dry plain, the desert scene that we see in Fess Parker or John Wayne, that may have been the condition of the city at the time.
Yeah,
Something
I don't doubt it
I'd
at all.
like to envision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it's good when you hear a story like this to be able to see it while it's being told to you or while you're reading it. But for the sake of time, because we're over halfway through, so I better hurry it up here. But the fourth day, Coes had lost dozens of men, and 250 men and officers had deserted. He was waiting for reinforcements from Ugartechia, which he got. They were convicts. They didn't know how to load the rifles, and they began attacking the Mexican soldiers, including Coes. So on December 9th, the 5th day of fighting, brutal hand-to-hand, room-to-room, house-to-house fighting, Coes gave up. So let's see here. Hold on. Lieutenant Colonel Sanchez Navarro of Coes, when he saw the Texans after they had surrendered, he was disgusted. He later wrote, "We were surrounded with crude bumpkins, proud and overbearing. Whoever knows the character of North Americans may appreciate the position in which we found ourselves." So
That is great.
I know, I love it. So all of these men their wounds would be dressed, they'd be fed, and then they would all be allowed to carry their weapons and enough shot to kill whatever engine came across them. And they were told to go back to Mexico and never return. Now, Coes, in a minute or in a couple of weeks, will run into Santa Anna, who will turn him around immediately. So he breaks that promise. Mexican dead was anywhere from 150 to 300, and the Texans lost 4 men. And there was
Wow.
one of those New Orleans gray guys would write, "We considered ourselves almost invincible." And
it's a good example of how convict soldiers make for a very demoralized regiment, because they're under military discipline. They're told, you form into line, you fire, you run from the line, we'll shoot you. They're felons. They're basically sent to their deaths, and they have every reason to break at first opportunity.
Exactly. Yep. And that's also a big problem in the Mexican War 10 years from now as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Grant had some things to say about that subject.
Yes, he did. Yeah. So there was a 29-year-old Kentuckian named Green Jameson, and he stayed. So most of the Texans went home after this battle. They won. Clearly, Mexico was going to grant us our statehood, because they still weren't ready to leave yet. Mexico's going to grant us our statehood. This is, late January by now. And they're like, so we're going to go home, and there's no reason to prepare for a Mexican army coming. Houston knew better. And he was like, we have to be ready. And we have to be ready by 20th of February or the first day of March. Now, he was a little bit off on that, because by then Santa Anna was already around at the Alamo. But in between that time and after this battle was won, this Green Jameson saw the Alamo and realized, or the mission of San Antonio de Valero, and he said, we can defend this. So the mission of San Antonio de Valero was built about 100 years before the Texas Revolution. And this was the third iteration of that mission, because San Antonio would get a proper church in 1793. The church abandoned the building, and the Spanish government turned it into a barracks and an armory. But it was in such bad shape, the tower and the dome and most of the ceilings had caved in. There was a 2-story stone building, known as the Long Barracks, and it was in much better shape. And there was also a smaller 1-story building known as the Low Barracks. Those 2 buildings are still there if you go to the Alamo today. It was 3 acres, which people don't know. And there was a 12-foot high wall surrounding the 3 acres, and it was 2 or 3 feet thick. So Green Jameson saw all this and said, we can spend the next couple of months turning this place into a fortress. So they did. He put holes in parapets in the walls to shoot from. They built platforms, because the Mexicans, Coes, left 12 cannons. So they built platforms to raise the cannons so they can shoot over those 12-foot high walls. And he built a giant ramp inside the Alamo church, the Alamo proper, the church. And he put he didn't put the 18-pounder. He put a couple cannons up there, and he envisioned their sharpshooters being up there. So at the same time, the numbers were down to less than 200 by now of Texans still staying to defend San Antonio. They went from around 500 maybe to 200, and men were leaving every day. The Texas commander was a man named Colonel James Neal. And with these 200 men, 100 of them decided, let's go take the Mexican town across the Rio Grande called Matamoros. And when they did that, they took all the good stuff, all the food, all the medicine, all the good weapons, and they went on this ill-fated mission that never happens and causes a lot of problems, but we don't got time for that. So by mid-January, less than 80 men were left to defend San Antonio. They were hungry, nearly naked, and they had not been paid. So Houston realized this was futile. He ordered everything useful out of it and for it to be leveled. He wanted to meet Santa Anna in the field, Napoleonic style, where Sam Houston and the Texans could decide the battlefield because they were good horsemen. They had better rifles. And so he sent Jim Bowie and 30 men to San Antonio with the command of evacuate and destroy, which Jim Bowie would not do. So at this time, Santa Anna had spent $7 million on his army, emptied the national treasury, and in January, he was in Saltillo with 6,000 troops. He had even sent an advance force of 1,500 Mexican soldiers under General Joaquin Ramirez y Sesma. He was already at the Rio Grande with those 1,500 troops. And Santa Anna's plan was to march through the entirety of Texas on the old Camino Real. He was going to go through every town, including and especially San Antonio, until he reached the Sabine River, which was the border of the United States at that time. And along the way, he was going to kill every Anglo-Texan. On February 1st, his army of, again, over 6,000 men, which were 2 infantry brigades, a cavalry, artillery units, and his stormtroopers, or zapadores, they marched towards Texas. So Bowie and his 30 men arrived to the Alamo. He took one look around and was like, "No, we're not leveling this." So the commander, Neal, pretty much told Houston, "We don't have the beasts of burden to haul these cannons out, nor do we have the will." So Bowie was kind of converted to, all right, we're going to stay here. And Bowie, with his connection to the Tejanos in San Antonio, was able to gather food and clothing and kind of get the Tejanos in better relations with these Anglos. And on January 26th, one of Bowie's men, an Alabama named James Bonham, Bonham and Bowie signed this resolution demanding food, ammo, clothing from the barely functioning government of Texas. They signed it and sent it off. And in the letter, they wrote, "The salvation of Texas depends in great measure on keeping Behar, or San Antonio de Bexar, out of the hands of the enemy. It serves as the frontier piquet guard, and if it were in the possession of Santa Anna, there is no stronghold from which to repel him in his march toward the Sabine. Colonel Neal and myself have come to the solemn resolution that we will rather die in these ditches than give it up to the enemy."
And indeed, they did.
Yes.
Yeah, they kept their resolution.
Yep. So by the
I'm
30th,
curious. I'm curious about the nomenclature. I read these words. I don't always understand how they were pronounced. Did they say Bihar? Was that the Texian pronunciation?
The Texian pronunciation would be Bexar, but the Spaniards or Mexicans by now would have said San Antonio de Behar.
So do modern day Texans say Bexar?
I think they just call it San Antonio now. I think they dropped the de Bexar part.
Yeah,
I would imagine. If they call Tejas Texas, then I imagine they call Bexar Behar, or other way around, Behar Bexar. But
I like how the Texans rebrand some of these words, like the Texan or Texian pronunciation, San Jacinto.
Yeah.
And they're steadfast on that. They get to pronounce it the gringo way, which I love.
They earned it.
They did.
So in late January, 26-year-old William Barrett Travis, a very important man, he rode in to the Alamo with 39 men. He was now lieutenant colonel of cavalry, and he did not want to go to the Alamo. He basically told Houston, "I will do anything except die at the Alamo." and if his requests were ignored, he would resign. But by mid-February, after arriving there, he also changed his mind. And he would write the Governor Smith and say, "We are determined to sustain it as long as there is a man left, because we consider death preferable to disgrace, which would be the result of giving up a post which has been so dearly won, and thus opening the door for the invaders to enter the sacred territories of the colonies. I am determined to defend it to the last, and should Bexar fall, your friend will be buried beneath its ruins."
Mm.
So they were determined. And also on the 12th, Neil, the commander, all these men were showing up. A man had showed up 4 days before, I'm about to talk about. But all these men were military men and kind of famous men. So he felt pushed out. So he left. He gave the command to Travis. Travis would hold an election. He and Bowie would split that election. Bowie would get so rip-roaringly angry and drunk that he would release all the prisoners from the jail in San Antonio, and he would force everyone to get drunk with him. The next day he would apologize, and they would split the command of the Alamo. But by now, I got a whole. I already talked about that. So they fortified the Alamo, and a couple days before Neil left on February 8th, the most famous man in Texas arrived, which is of course David, or as he was known, but not preferred, Davy Crockett. So
Mm.
in my episode, I have like a bunch of paragraphs about his background. It's great, but he was a very important man. I mean, he was known for bear hunting. He was also known for, at one point, he aimed a rifle up in a tree at a raccoon, and the raccoon climbed down and surrendered, threw up his hands. He had fought in the War of 1812 under Andrew Jackson, but he was a Whig, so they kind of had a falling out. Yeah, he was a congressman 3 times, and he was almost vice president for the Whig Party. By this point, he'd been a politician for nearly 20 years. And his kind of champion cause was the underdogs and the common man, the landless and luckless class of Americans from which he himself had come from. And he advocated for better treatment of the Indians. So obviously, he was not popular in Washington. And eventually, when he lost his seat in D.C., he reportedly and famously said, "You may all go to hell, and I will go to Texas." So one of these, he came with something called the Tennessee Mounted Volunteers. And one of these men was 22-year-old Daniel Cloud, who I quoted from earlier. He said, "Ever since Texas has unfurled the banner of freedom and commenced a warfare of liberty or death, our hearts have been enlisted in her behalf. If we succeed, the country is ours. It is immense in extent and fertile in its soil, and will amply reward all our toil. If we fail, death in the cause of liberty and humanity is not a cause for shuddering." So all of these men, they spoke about Jefferson's Empire of Liberty.
Yeah, it is remarkable how the sentiment was so universalist at this time. Like every, in the percentages of the human race at this time, you've got a few tens of thousands of people viewing their struggle as the struggle of all mankind.
Yeah, the struggle of liberty and self-determination against the establishments of the old world, against monarchy, against the established church. It's a very consistent theme. There's a great triple biography called 3 Roads to the Alamo by William Davis, who is a prolific writer and a valuable one, very detail oriented. And it's a biography of Bowie, Travis, and Crockett, all in one volume, kind of alternates between the 3. And it's a theme that we see in the story of early Texas. This was a place for people to start over again. With the case of Travis, Bowie, and Crockett, we see these are ambitious men, sometimes kind of criminal, like Bowie, kind of on the outs, looking for any way to make a buck. And in the case of Crockett and Travis, it's more like personal problems and frustration in public life and things like that. They make their way out to Texas to try a new start. And in the case of Houston, he's the most successful of them all. Of course, the three others, they all die at the Alamo.
Mm.
But they're very compelling stories. You know, they're the stories of frontiersmen, of entrepreneurs, of men that are out to make their stake in the world.
Exactly. It was the promise. That's why I loved that quote from the book you reprinted in the beginning. It had so much promise, and it was an exciting land. The last, I don't want to scroll up, but like the last place of the fight for liberty against the tyrants. So
Yes, indeed.
by the 23rd of February, the Mexican cavalry began lining up just beyond the hills of San Antonio. And the night before, the Texans in San Antonio had thrown a fandango in celebration of George Washington. And so they were a little slow to rise that morning. But when they did wake up, the entire town, all the Tejanos, were leaving, packing up everything they could, and they were leaving. Travis, he begged the people, like, why are you leaving? And they didn't answer him, or they lied. He eventually said, all right, nobody can leave, which made everyone leave even faster. Finally, a resident of San Antonio told him, a courier from Santa Ana told us last night that the army was only 8 miles away, and if we didn't leave, we would be killed. So Travis didn't believe it, sent a man up in the church tower. Eventually, that man in the church tower rang the bells in the afternoon because the Mexicans were indeed right there. So,
And thus
yep,
was the Alamo invested.
Yep. There's some stuff I can't read because I don't think I can get through it, so I'll skip that.
No, don't spoil the next one. We will cover the grim siege itself on the next installment of American
Alrighty.
Spirits.
Yep. Sounds perfect.
All right. With that, we have a super chat to get through. Chief Sling and Beef sends $5. My two favorite fellow Southrons of historical hype in the house. I will not be calling you a homosexual this time, Thomas. Good luck in your race.
Thank you, sir. I hope to see you later on in the month. Thank you.
Indeed. And on that subject, there will be no American Spirits next Monday, as the Old Glory Club has other business that we'll be conducting. But we look forward to seeing you all thereafter. Mr. Bagby, do you have closing thoughts and/or shillings to offer us?
Yes. I have the aforementioned volume by Stevenson on Texas and the Mexican War, which I have through my press, Tallman Books. You can find that at www.tallmanbooks.com. I also have recently put a biography of Sam Houston back into print. It's the great literary biography called The Raven by Marquis James. It's not yet on my website, but if you go to my Twitter handle, you can find a link to it. That's at Tallman Books.
He went with The Raven and not Big Drunk, huh?
That's right. That was his given Cherokee name for his black hair.
Mr. Wayne Riley, have you any exciting news you might wish to hype?
If anyone listening is in Bernalillo County, District 5, please vote for me. I'm running for county commissioner.
Vote for Mr. Riley. Elect Mr. Riley. Vote early and often.
Early and often.
Riley, does anyone say Bernalillo County?
I have not heard that, and if I did, I might get sick to my stomach a little bit, but no, I have not heard that.
So is that the gringo pronunciation of the word?
I think the Mexican, I'll just say Mexican. The Mexican way to say it would be Bernalillo, because there's only one L in the beginning there, so it would have to be two double L's. Bernalillo.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, or they might actually change that to a Y if there's two. I don't know. I don't speak Mexican. I can, but I don't.
And
I don't speak Mexican either.
And yet all your land titles are in Mexican.
That is true. Yeah. Other than that, just listen to my podcast, theamericans.southwest.com. If you subscribe to me, you've got 6 episodes. Oh, shoot. I'm on 5 episodes on the Mexican War already.
Excellent. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Mr. Riley, I look forward to seeing you in a few days. And everyone else,